Good morning. My name is Kathleen and I'm the owner and dyer behind Good Noodle Yarn Co. I hope you all are doing well today. I am dyeing this morning a new colorway that I'm developing for the shop. It's called Hippopotamus. It is a 4-layered gray variegated yarn. So today I'm going to show you each of the 4 layers, how I apply them, what colors I'm using, kind of my thought process behind it. And then at the end I have a full skein of Hippopotamus that is already dried that I can show you. And although this is very new, so I don't have a project per se, I do have a picture of a swatch that I did yesterday that I can show you so you can kind of see how it all turns out. The dye pan so that you can see what I'm doing over here. You can see that I have 4 pans going at the same time. There are 4 different bases that I dye on routinely. They are 75% superwash merino and 25% nylon. I have that in a sock weight and also in a DK weight. And then I also have 2 sparkly yarns, which are also 75% superwash merino and 20% of the nylon, and then there's 5% of the silver stellina. Those are the 4 main bases that I dye on. The reason why I've chosen to do that is because I'm hoping to make hand-dyed yarn a little bit more accessible for everybody. I know it's an investment. It can be very expensive, especially if you start looking at the very like the yarns with the cashmere. So what I'm trying to do is trying to make not only the yarn more affordable, but I'm also trying to make the yarn so that you're not afraid to use it. So these are very, as far as hand-dyed yarns go, they're fairly durable. Obviously you can see that they're in hot water here now and not having any problems. I also routinely throw my stuff in the wash. I don't want you to be afraid to use it. I don't want you to think that it's so precious that you've got it sitting up on your shelf and you don't know what to do with it. So that is why I've chosen these 4 bases. Now I'm going to go ahead and head over to the dye pans and talk about the first layer that I'm doing. I'm going to be honest, I struggle with gray. It is, I love gray, I really do. But there are grays that have a beige undertone. There's grays that have a purple undertone. There's grays that have more of a blue undertone. For me, finding the right combination of these has been a little bit challenging. This is where I think I am at this point. I'm using 4 different colors of gray. The first color that I'm going to apply is a really light, almost silver color, which puts a good base coat down. You can see in this pan right here, I already have the silver applied. Since these are colors that I'm making for the shop in a particular colorway, a little bit fussy about my weighing of the amount of dye that I'm putting on, just so that I can make sure to get it as accurate as possible, so that from one pan to the other after they're all finished, you can tell that they're the same colorway. Now, one thing that I have been playing with this week is usually when I'm dyeing in these small pans, I do 2 skeins of yarn at the same time, or 200 grams. And what I've been playing with this week is doing 3 skeins or 300 grams at one time. Obviously, you would need to adjust the amount of dye that you use because you have 100 grams more than you did before. But it's also been a little bit of a challenge trying to figure out now how much water I have in the pan to start out with versus how much actual liquid that I'm putting in along with the dyes, because I don't want things to get too dilute and kind of all over the place, but I also don't want it to be too concentrated with some of the colors. The next color that I'm going to be applying is kind of in the next shade up. I'm going from lightest to darkest. This is it's similar to the first silver color that we put on, except it's a little bit more concentrated, so it's just a little bit more purple to it, I think. Now you can see that there's just this little bit of dye that I'm actually using. But I'm going to fill up this cup to the top with more water just to kind of dilute that dye just a little bit and make it so that it's a little easier to pour. I'm going to go ahead and rearrange this yarn here. Now, if you notice when I pull it out of the water, this is a really long skein. And when I put it back into the water to be dyed for the next layer, kind of move this yarn down about 1/4 of the way so that when this goes in this time, it's a different portion of the yarn that is going in first than went in during the first pour. So the more concentrated areas of dye are in the water so that they're not going to get this, the first pour of the darker dye that I'm putting on top. Now, since there is obviously water in the pan and the dye is going to not only hit the yarn, but it's also going to get into the water itself, every color that I'm using is going to kind of go throughout the whole yarn. It's just this first This first pour on top is where I'm trying to get the lighter colors that haven't had as much of the dye, so that's getting that color first. As you can see, this color is a little bit darker than the last one that we put on. It has a little bit more of purplish undertone, I would say. Now, after I pour this on, the main part of the dye is going to be hitting and setting on this yarn pretty much right away since everything is so warm. But I'm then going to push the yarn in just a little bit so it's kind of in contact with the water so that any residual dye that's kind of hanging out on top or kind of goes over to the side is all going to mix together, and it's going to get the underside of it with some of that. The next color that I'm going to put on, I need to actually mix first. I need to make some more of it. It isn't a color that I use all that often, so I have a pretty small jar of it, and I need some more of that since I'm doing so many skeins of yarn today, let's say. We can get into the math another time, the whole like dyeing with the math thing, which can be a little overwhelming and a little complicated if I'm just sitting here talking about it. But the basic concept behind it is the dye stocks that I use are 1% dye stock, which means for every 100 milliliters of water that I use, I'm using 1 gram of dye. So that all of my dye stocks that I have are all 1%. So I know for the amount of liquid that I pour out, I know how much dye there's going to be every time I pour out, which is why I mix like that. So there's a little bit of dye that I have left over. I'm just going to pour that into this cup for now. So the first thing I do is I fill up and measure the amount of water that I'm putting in. I'm going to call it 350 milliliters. Since I have 350 milliliters of water, I'm going to need to put 3.5 grams of my dye powder inside of this to make that 1% stock solution, which is my base of everything else that I do. Now, when you're handling when the powder is out and not in the liquid yet, it's important that you don't inhale it because it can cause respiratory issues, but also over time, it can cause kind of almost like an allergic reaction to it, kind of an autoimmune allergic reaction to it, and it can make it so that you're not able to use the dyes at all, which would be kind of sad. There are 2 masks that you can use, 2 types of masks you can use. This is the one that I prefer to use. It's a 3M. It's a NIOSH approved. This is a little pricey if this isn't something that you're doing all the time. So one thing that you can use is you can use these N95 masks that are disposable. I just got mine, I think, from either Lowe's or Home Depot or something. It's over like where the painting and stuff is. So I'm going to put this mask on and my voice is going to be muffled, so I'm going to be quiet for a sec. And I'm just going to measure out 3.5 grams of this dye. Once the powder is in the liquid, and once I have the container that I put the little thing that I measured in, I stick that in water over in the same spoon. I put in the old dye so that all of the powder is in the liquid right now. So there's no issue with having with taking your mask off. Now this that I have here it's a little jewelry scale, so it measures the powder and pretty, you can measure things very accurately. Once I have the dye in the liquid, give it a good stir. There's some dyes that dilute in the water better than others. Some of them are pretty clumpy, but this particular one does pretty well. After I have it in there, I give it another shake. I get these tops for the mason jars that I use. They're meant for like you're doing like a fruit infusion or something, or even like a big thing of iced tea. You can stick these on top and it makes it easier to pour because you're not having to hold on to the glass and the glass isn't slipping out of your hand. It also has a gasket on the underside, like a rubber gasket, so that it doesn't spill. I love so that I can make sure that it's all mixed well. The rest of the dye that I have in here, so then not that I'm expecting there to be, but in case there's a little bit of a variation between both of the dye stocks, this will kind of mix it together and it kind of all works itself out. Now this color is a little bit darker, still on the purpley, maybe a little bit more towards the bluey side. Yeah, I would say blue. And I'm also using proportionally a little bit more of it than I am with the other colors, the other 2 that I've used so far. So you can say this is about the amount of dye that I have in here. I'm going to go ahead and again fill this up the rest of the way with water. All right, and again, just rearranging the yarn. I was afraid when I started trying dyeing more yarn in each pan, I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to get it to look the same, to dye up the same. Since there's more yarn in the pan, then there's not as much area on the outside or in between where just the water is exposed. So I was concerned that most of the dye was going to be staying right here on the yarn and there wasn't going to be as much that would go underneath. But I figured out if I increase the amount of liquid that I use, obviously I'm increasing the amount of dye. So far it seems to be going pretty well, which obviously makes it more efficient because I can dye more at one time. But most importantly, I wanted to make sure that I was still able to get the yarn to look the way that I wanted it to. You can see this color is quite a bit darker. Push this under the water a little bit. When I'm over here dyeing, I can't actually see my computer screen. So if you are having any questions or anything, I'd be glad to answer them when I head back over there. But right now I can't actually see what's there. And also, if you are watching this at a later time and you're not watching it live, you're more than welcome to message me either on Instagram or on Facebook. And if there's any questions that you have, I can get back to you, and then I can also talk about it the next time I stream. The last color that I'm doing is I'm actually using black, but I don't want it to actually look black. Like, I don't want little spaces of black. What I found just through kind of experimenting is the best looking charcoal gray that I can get is by using a black dye and just putting about half the amount that I normally would, and that gets me kind of a good charcoal gray color, which is what I'm wanting as the last layer on this particular dye. So since this is it's a black that I'm using, I don't need to use very much of it at all, since I'm not actually trying to get a black out of this. This is just a tiny little bit. And if you've seen me dye before, you'll know that usually on my last layer, I don't put quite as much water in it because I want it to be kind of a concentrated area that ends up on the final yarn. But since this is black and I don't want it to be black, I'm still going to go ahead and pour the water all the way up to the top like I would do on previous layers, just so that when I pour it, you can see that it's dark and it's going to be, kind of a blackish color, but it's still going to kind of disperse itself around the yarn pretty well. And I'm going to stick it under the water. The dye that I just put on, and also all the rest of the dye, has a good chance to set in this heat. Probably going to continue to heat for about half an hour or so. Sometimes it might take as long as 45 minutes, depending on the depth of the color that I'm doing. And since there's black in this, then quite possible I might need a little bit of extra time. After everything is all absorbed and has had a chance to, do its little chemical thing inside the yarn, then I just turn the heat off, and then I just let it cool down slowly over the next couple of hours until it's back at room temperature. And then I will rinse it out. I use a little bit of wool wash, and then I spin it dry, somewhat dry, some of the extra water out. I just use the spin cycle in my washer, and then I hang it up to dry. Now, obviously, you can see that this is the only one that is actually finished with all of the dye. I'm going to need to put the extra layers on, and I'll do that after I get off of this stream. I want to make sure that they all have the amount of time that they need to sit. Okay, I'm going to show you the skein that I have that is completed. I'm calling this Hippopotamus just kind of because of the grays and everything in it. This is showing up a little bit brighter there. It's actually a little bit more accurate if I hold it back here. But you can see kind of the silver colors. You can see kind of the 4 different depths of gray that are on here. And then you can see kind of towards here. This is that kind of black color, although it's not a real solid black. It's more of a charcoal gray, I guess. But I think this would be a beautiful neutral if you're making a pair of socks, and you kind of want kind of a more kind of everyday sock. You still want it to be pretty, but then you can use like a neon color as like your heels and toes. So that's kind of what my thought is behind this yarn, is having it kind of a neutral background, and then using any brighter colors, neons or whatever, as a pop. Now I have a sock machine, a circular sock machine, which I use just to make up swatches of yarn so that I can see what it's going to look like and see whether it's looking like the way that I want it to look like, right? So I did this yesterday. This is what it ended up looking like. You can see through here the silverish, but you can see the different depths of the gray, and you can see one of them. There's almost a little bit of a beigey gray to it. I try very hard to stream live every 2 weeks on Wednesday mornings. Sometimes I need to switch the day, but usually I'm pretty good at it. Now, what I'm also going to do with this particular stream, you're going to be able to find it up on Facebook and YouTube if you want to watch it again, but I'm going to edit it down with a lot of the chatting out of it and just more focused on how to actually dye the yarn, so that if you want to try to do this yourself, then you can just kind of focus in on the actual dyeing part. And if you do, I would love to see it. If you happen to have any of my yarn and are knitting with it or crocheting with it or weaving with it, I would love to see pictures of that too. I am Good Noodle Yarn Co. on all of the social places. I hang out mainly on Instagram and also on Facebook. but I also do have a little bit of a presence over on the YouTube now. So you can find me there. You can message me and you can either tag me in your post so I can see what you're doing, or you can use the hashtag GoodNoodleYarnCo, and then I'll find it that way. And then I'd love to be able to share that on my following stream that I'm going to do next week. And I hope you all have a great week. Stay cool, and I will see you next time.